And let's get into that passage.
Sure, let's talk.
Why do Jehovah's Witnesses
Mm,
have a problem with this passage that says, in the beginning was the Word, memory,
sure,
and the Word was with God, and the Word was God?
sure.
Why is that a problem for so many people?
Ah, man, we'll be here all day. By the way, I would argue that for Jehovah's Witness, there's something else that's at play as well. I have friends and family members who are Jehovah's Witness, and I think there's something else that's at play where when there's somebody telling you what the word has to mean, and you can't see it for yourself. So if any of them are watching, I would definitely tell you, like, I know what it feels like to have someone tell you what the word says, and then God opens your eyes, and you never want to go back. But I'll tell you this. So they basically believe, and here's the argument. They come to the text. You said it earlier: biases, assumptions, presuppositions. They basically are so used to arguing against Trinitarians that they say, hey, first of all, they believe Jesus is created, right? They believe he was an angel,
Yeah.
he was created. Let's just say they believe he was Michael the Archangel, which we'd have to do like 2 podcasts to do that one, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is they come with the presupposition that there can only be one who's fully divine. There cannot be a son who also is fully divine. Once you challenge that, and by the way, let me show you how you challenge that. First of all, they come there, and when you look at the Greek text, there's 3 possibilities, and I'll say 3 here to kind of narrow it down. And here, by the way, I'm quoting the work of my favorite Trinitarian Greek grammarian, Daniel Wallace, right? If her title is my favorite theologian, then Daniel Wallace is my favorite Trinitarian grammarian. He has a whole section in his grammar on this. But he says, when you look at how the Greek is structured, right?
Yeah.
First of all, and by the way, I say this in my book all over the place. They assume that you're either the definitive God or you're indefinite God, right? Definitive God, the God, the Father, right? Or they'll say indefinite, a God, right? In English, we have the and we have a. The is the definite article, a is the indefinite article. In Greek, there's no indefinite article, right? Not that you need one, right? But what they assume is, well, it says there, and the word was theos, and actually it says theos was the word was, right? If you want to actually use word order. But they're correct that it does begin before and after by using the God for the Father. In the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God, ha theos. He was pros ton theon, right? Pros ton theon, right? That's the definite article God. And that's clearly the Father. And all throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament, that definite article is usually how they'll distinguish the Father, right? In fact, I wish everyone had glasses that you could put on and just see the definite articles on the Greek text. It would blow you away how often it's used. Hebrew and Greek, by the way, does this, right? Even in Hebrew, definite article. I'm not saying it's used 99% of the time, but I'm saying, close to it, maybe 95% of the time. But I'm saying that most often the predominant way of referring to the Father is the God. So in my book, I just coined the phrase the definitive God, right? The Most High God. And so John sandwiches the statement about Christ by 2 statements about Jesus being with the Father or the God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the God. And he says, and the Word was God. And then he says again, he was in the beginning with the God, right? So we know who he's talking about, who he was with. He was with the Father. In the middle, John also wants to say, but the Word was God. He wasn't saying a God, and he wasn't saying the God. There's a third option, and everybody misses this. You can say the word is the definitive God, indefinite, but there's also what's known as qualitative. Qualitative means God is what he was. A lot of people forget that God is also used objectively, and especially in John uses this throughout, right? I'll give some examples that you know right out of the gate. God is love, not the love, not a love. No, God is love. God is light. God is spirit, right? He's not a spirit, right? He's spirit. He's talking about him being spirit and who he is. But here's one in John 14. It says, John chapter 1, verse 14, and the word became flesh. Exactly parallel with what the word was God and the word became flesh. You see the verbs and you see how it's used also with the association that he's doing with the flesh. But flesh is not the flesh. It's not a flesh. It's simply flesh as a category, right? Like when I look at a passage like Isaiah 31, verses 1 through 3, where God can talk about himself and say, hey, you've trusted in the Egyptians, but the Egyptians, are men, not God. Their horses, their horses are flesh, not spirit, right? Now, when he uses spirit and God there, he's contrasting that with man and flesh, meaning what we are, right? And by the way, it uses exactly how John uses it in John 1. That's in Isaiah 31, verse 1 to 3. In verse 3, he uses that word God and spirit qualitatively, just like he could say spirit and flesh, right? And so the word was God. That's what he was. He became flesh. And so just like we wouldn't say a flesh or the flesh, we know flesh is a category. More sophisticated Jehovah's Witnesses now know that that's an argument. And when when in doubt, all you got to do is point them to a book like this, where he shows how John especially uses that qualitative language throughout. God is light, God is love, God is spirit. Same about Christ, right? The word was spirit, was God. The word became flesh. Now, I will argue, I believe that Jesus, when he became flesh, he took on what we were, right? He took on, like existing in the form of God. He humbled himself and he took on our nature. So as the classic preacher said, subtraction by addition, right? He humbled himself. He didn't lose what he was, but he took on what we are to save us. I do agree with the ancient Trinitarians who will say anything that Christ did not assume unto himself is not redeemed by his redemption. In other words, he had to become what we were to save all that we are. And so I believe when Christ was a man, he was a man, but he was obviously, the Son of God. And that's why you find even the demons trembling before him. He wasn't just a human like us.
Right. Well, it also says in verse 14 that he is the monogenes, the only begotten of the Father. And in the Greek, that means the only race, stock, kind, family of the Father. So he's the same family of the Father. He was with the God, meaning the sovereign, the head. And he was also God, the same kind as the Father, the same family.
Amen.
And
Amen.
I mean, I don't know how they can argue when it says all things, verse 3, were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and so on. And it plainly says in the book of Isaiah that Yahweh created all things with his hands, his own hands, and so on. And here it's talking that the Word did all these things. And, like we said before, no man has seen God at any time. So who's Isaiah speaking of? But the second member of the divine family.
A Jehovah's Witness would agree with that. A Jehovah's Witness will agree that God created all things through him, but they won't say what you just said before, which John said in verse 3. By the way, John 1:3, especially in the Greek text, is a problem, because John's even more intense. He says, through him, and obviously Jesus, he's focusing on Jesus' agency, same as we see in Corinthians, Colossians, Hebrews, all throughout the Bible, right? The agency of Christ. All things are created through him. And then John says this is literal rendering. And without him, not one thing. And the word one is in the text. It's the number one. Not one thing was created that has been created. Now, let me use the word created there. It's the word genomai in the Greek. This is the most foundational way of saying something being brought into existence, right? Being something that has come about, right? Like Jesus can say, before Abraham was, I am. Now, what's interesting, that word for was is different than what's used for Christ in John chapter 1. The word for was for Abraham is the word genomai. Before Abraham, genomai, came to be. I am, right? And so when you read Christ, especially in 1:3 there, and there's other passages I would use to make this point, but when John said, he says it positively, then he says it negatively. Through him, all things were made that have been made. If it falls under the category of it being genomai, right? And that's the word, right? Like when God says in Genesis, let there be, and there was, and there was, or, is the genomai, and there was, it came to be. That's genomai is translated that way in the Septuagint. But John says there's nothing that came to be that didn't come to be through him and without him. meaning not apart from him, but only through him came to be not one thing that ever came to be. And that word one is in the text, not one. And my joke is what they're saying is there is one. And I'm saying, John's saying there's not one, right? So either there is one or there's not one. I'm going to go with John.
And let me just add to that. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, which is ego emi in the Greek, used in the Septuagint for Exodus, the 3rd chapter. Amen. And that's Yahweh God, the second divine member of the God family. He's called the angel of the Lord or the messenger of the Lord, and that's the spokesman, John 1:1, the Word. So it all fits together, and there's just no confusion whatsoever.